The problem, as I've come to understand it, after many years sitting beside fires like this one, listening to stories that people believe are about one thing but turn out to be about something else entirely, is that a man who interviews 20 candidates and rejects every one of them is not looking for a tutor. He is looking for himself, reflected back without argument. Settle in, dear friends. Pull your chair a little closer. This story begins at Bellwood Manor on a Tuesday in October, in the year the maples along the Eastern Drive had turned a particularly unreasonable shade of red, and it begins, as the finest ones always do, with a man who was completely certain he understood what he required. His name was Lord Elliot Wyndham, the Earl of Bellwood, and he had spent 7 weeks interviewing candidates for the position of tutor to his son. 20 of them. He interviewed all 20 in the same room, at the same desk, with the same opening remarks, delivered with the polished efficiency of a man who had managed a large estate since the age of 26 and had never once been told he was doing it incorrectly. He described the position. He described his son. He described his expectations. Then he listened to the candidates agree with him, and he sent them away. Too passive, too energetic. Excellent Latin, but weak natural philosophy. Strong mathematics, but something in the manner he could not name and did not try to. One woman arrived with letters of recommendation from 3 separate families, all calling her the finest instructor their children had ever had. He declined her, because she had answered his question about educational method before he'd finished asking it, and he found the interruption disrespectful. His steward, a composed and long-serving man named Mr. Fenn, stopped remarking on the rejections after the 12th interview, not for lack of opinion, but because he had observed the particular shape of his employer's dissatisfaction and concluded, with the quiet intelligence of a man who knows when to speak and when to hold his tongue, that the problem would not be solved by commentary. Notice something, dear friends. 20 interviews, 7 weeks, a son of 9, with no consistent instruction, a stack of unanswered correspondence on the desk about the boy's preparation, and a father who could identify the flaw in every candidate with perfect clarity. That is a man who has decided, without quite admitting it to himself, that no one will do. The question is why, and that is what the 21st interview answered. She arrived on a Tuesday. Her name was Miss Cecilia Price, found by Mr. Fenn through a scholarly acquaintance in Halifax, who had written, "Miss Price is not the sort of tutor you will have encountered before. I recommend her for precisely that reason." Mr. Fenn set the letter on Lord Wyndham's desk with the neutrality of a man presenting information he believes will prove important. Lord Wyndham read it once, set it down, and prepared himself, moderately, carefully, the way a man does after 20 disappointments, for the 21st. Miss Price arrived at the stated hour, which was something. 3 of the 20 had been late, and he'd found that disqualifying. She was perhaps 30, plainly dressed in the practical way of someone whose work required her full attention and had no interest in competing with the furniture. She sat, folded her hands, and waited. He began the description of the position. He had given it 20 times. He was 4 sentences in when she said, "May I ask a question before you continue?" He stopped. She was looking back with the steady attention of someone who has asked a reasonable question and is waiting, without apology, for a reasonable answer. "Go on," he said. "What do you want George to be able to do that he cannot do now?" He opened his mouth. He closed it again. It was, he would recognize later, the first question any of the 21 had asked that was about the boy rather than the position. "He is behind in his studies," Lord Wyndham said. "He requires a comprehensive program across the standard disciplines: mathematics, Latin, natural philosophy, composition." "Yes," she said, patient, as though following a conversation to its actual point. "But what do you want him to be able to do?" The study was quiet. Lord Wyndham looked at her and thought, with the particular jolt of a man encountering something genuinely unexpected, "No one has asked me that." "Think," he said finally. I want him to think. She nodded once, as if this confirmed something. Then the problem is that the program you've just described is a program for a boy who will memorize and recite, which is useful. But it is not a program for a boy who will think. Those are different programs, and they are not entirely compatible, and no one has been honest with you about that. I beg your pardon. She did not repeat herself. She waited. You are saying the method I have outlined is wrong. I am saying it will produce a different result from the one you want. Whether that makes it wrong depends on which result you prefer. There is a particular silence, dear friends, that falls when someone says the true thing in a room that has not heard it before, not a comfortable silence, but an instructive one. Lord Wyndham thought, 20 interviews. Not one of them said this. He thought, she has been in this room for 6 minutes. He thought, either she is correct, or she is the most impertinent person I have spoken with in 11 years of managing this estate. And then, after a further moment, she is correct. Tell me about the program for a boy who will think, he said. She told him. It involved considerably more questioning and considerably less recitation than he had outlined. It involved teaching George to identify what he did not know. The most undervalued skill in traditional instruction, she said, with the slight edge of someone who has watched the idea meet resistance before. It involved going outside and looking at things and writing down what was actually seen rather than what was expected to be seen. The Latin is useful, she said. But Latin taught as a series of forms to be memorized produces a boy who can decline a noun and cannot construct an argument. I would rather teach him Latin as a system of logic, which is what it actually is, and which produces a boy who can do both. The previous tutors, Lord Wyndham said, why did none of them suggest this? Because you did not ask for it. You described what you wanted, and they agreed with you, because agreeing is safer than correcting. You did not find it safer to agree. No. Why not? She considered the question, the specific pause of someone deciding whether to give the short answer or the true one, and gave the true one. Because I spent a number of years agreeing when I should have corrected, and it did not serve the children I was teaching. A tutor who agrees with everything the parent wants and says nothing about what the child actually needs is not a tutor. She is a very expensive echo. Lord Wyndham looked at the 21st candidate and thought, there it is. When can you start? Something crossed her face, brief and carefully managed. The flash of relief a person allows herself when she has said the difficult true thing and been rewarded for it rather than dismissed. Monday, she said, if that's convenient. Monday is convenient. She was at the door when he said, Miss Price. She turned. The previous tutors all agreed with the program I described. That is why none of them are still here. Yes, she said, I expect it is. She left. Mr. Fenn appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, wearing the expression of a man who had been occupying the corridor and would not pretend otherwise. Not a word, Lord Wyndham said. Of course, my lord. A pause. She starts Monday. Monday. Fenn nodded, satisfied, his correspondence from Halifax thoroughly vindicated. He was, Lord Wyndham suspected, going to be insufferably correct about this for a very long time. She was, as she'd implied, very good. No surprise there, given her references and the clarity of her thinking in the interview. What Lord Wyndham had not specifically, stiffly anticipated was how the goodness showed itself. Not the competence of someone following a curriculum, but of someone who understood the particular child in front of her and built the curriculum outward from that understanding. He noticed the change the way you notice a sound that's been present so long you'd stopped registering it, and then it's gone. George had been producing a low, steady note of educational friction, small resistances, a boy who could read but wouldn't, who could sit but preferred not to, who had been managed until he'd learned to manage himself into a very efficient imitation of a student who wasn't there. By Thursday of the first week, the note was different. By the following Monday, it was gone. He said nothing, he observed. On the Wednesday of the second week, Miss Price sent a written account of the fortnight's work, 2 pages, arranged by subject, noting what George had done well, what needed adjustment, what she intended to try next. At the bottom, she'd added, "There is one thing I should flag. George has a significant gap in his understanding of basic arithmetic that has been papered over with memorized answers. He can recite multiplication tables accurately, but cannot apply them. This will need addressing before the natural philosophy program can proceed properly. I have started on it, 2 to 3 weeks." Lord Wyndham thought about the 11 tutors who had preceded her, some for several months, none of whom had mentioned this. He wrote back, "Proceed as you think best. The arithmetic should have been caught earlier. Thank you for catching it now." She replied, "I would also mention that the library's natural history section has not been dusted in some time and several volumes are damp. If not addressed before winter, some will be lost. I've mentioned it to the housekeeper." He hadn't known about the library. He confirmed with the housekeeper. The volumes were moved to a dryer room by the end of the week. Their exchanges continued this way, professional, clear, occasionally containing information he hadn't known he needed, delivered with the matter-of-fact air of someone who had noticed a thing and saw no reason not to mention it. It was efficient in a way he hadn't experienced with a member of his staff before, and for the first time since his wife died 3 years ago, he found he was not carrying the persistent weight of a father who knows his son is not being well served and cannot find the person to serve him properly. The weight was gone. He had given it to someone who could hold it, and she was holding it, and it was no longer his to carry in every spare moment. This left him with more time than he'd anticipated, and with the mildly disorienting feeling of a man who has handed off a long and difficult problem and doesn't quite know what to do with the hours it used to fill. He began noticing other things. On a Thursday morning in the 3rd week, George left his notebook on the hall table full. George's notebooks had never been full before. Lord Wyndham opened it to the middle page and found a diagram of a sparrow's wing, labelled in George's own hand, with notes on feather structure that weren't copied from any book. George had observed them and written what he saw. Lord Wyndham closed the notebook and left it where it was. On a Friday, passing the schoolroom, he heard something that didn't sound like a lesson. It sounded like an argument. The good kind, between 2 people genuinely disagreeing about something they both found interesting. George was insisting the diagram in the book was wrong. Miss Price was asking him, with that same calm precision from the interview, why he thought so and how he'd prove it. Lord Wyndham stood in the corridor and thought, he has never argued about a lesson before, he thought. She's teaching him to argue, he thought. This is what I meant when I said I wanted him to think, and I did not know how to ask for it. He moved on without mentioning that he'd stopped. The complication, as he would come to understand it, arrived in the 5th week. He'd begun reading the Wednesday reports differently. Not in method, but in focus. Reading them less for the information about George, and more for the quality of the thinking that produced it. The way she arranged the problems by significance. The way she flagged things that weren't yet problems but would become them. The way she wrote about his son, not as a student to be managed, but as a person to be understood. He was reading them, he eventually admitted to himself, because of the person writing them. He was aware of how this would look. A widowed earl developing an interest in his son's tutor was a story the county would recognize immediately and discuss with the particular relish reserved for things both predictable and entertaining. He did not want to be predictable. He also found, being honest with himself, that he did not want to not be interested. He addressed this the way he addressed things that required addressing. Directly. He found her in the garden on a Thursday afternoon, in the 5th week, in the corner near the kitchen that George had claimed as an observation post, making notes, while George measured something on the ground with a length of string. George saw him first and straightened, uncertain whether he was about to be called inside. "I won't interrupt," Lord Wyndham said. "Carry on." George glanced at Miss Price, who read the boy's face and said, "Go and measure the north bed as well. I'll catch up." George went. She turned, "My lord." "Miss Price." He came to stand near the beds. The October garden was past its best, but not without interest. She had a small pressed flower tucked inside her notebook's cover, the kind of thing a person keeps without quite deciding to. The natural history program. It's working well. George has a strong instinct for observation. He needed someone to tell him it was a valid form of thought. And no one had. No. "I did not tell him that," he said. "It was not easy to say, but he said it. I was told he was behind. I was told what he needed to catch up. I spent 7 weeks finding someone to make him catch up. I did not ask what he was good at." "You are asking now." "Yes." "He is good at looking at things," she said. "Really looking. Not the name of the thing itself. What it does, how it works, why it is the way it is. That's rare, and it's exactly what the natural philosophy tradition was built on. Why did none of the previous tutors say so? For the same reason, none of them corrected the arithmetic gap. Telling a parent his child is not what he thinks is a difficult conversation, and difficult conversations require a tolerance for uncertainty not everyone has. And you have it. I've practiced it, I did not always. What changed? She weighed the question seriously, the way she weighed anything she intended to answer truthfully. "I had a student once, exceptionally clever, and I taught her to perform cleverness rather than to be it, because that was what her family wanted, and I told them what they wanted to hear. She went on performing it for the next 10 years, by all accounts, and found it hollow." A pause. "I decided I would not teach the performance again, whatever it cost." The cost being the position. The cost being various positions, it has not always been well received. He looked at her, the pressed flower in her notebook, the sound of George measuring something beyond the wall, and thought of the 6 minutes it had taken her to correct him in that first interview. He thought, 21 interviews. Fenn was right about considerably more than he said. "I have been reading the Wednesday reports," he said, "with more attention than the information in them strictly requires." He looked at the wall George had disappeared behind. "I am aware of the position. I am aware how this might be read. I am not saying it to create a difficulty for you. I am saying it because I have not been saying it for 2 weeks, and the not saying it has become effortful in a way I did not expect." She was quiet a moment. "It does not create a difficulty." "No?" "No, it creates a question. What do you intend to do with it?" He thought about this in the thin October light. "Continue exactly as I have. Read the reports. Answer them. Come and find you in the garden on a Thursday and listen to you tell me what my son is good at." A pause. "And stop pretending the coming to find you is entirely professional." "That is a very careful intention," she said, looking at the flower in her notebook. "I am working within limits." The primary one being that George is doing well for the first time in 3 years, and I would prefer not to be interviewing a 22nd tutor. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "You're concerned I'll leave." "I am concerned about the right things in the right order. Your position here is the first concern. The rest is further down the list." She was quiet a long moment. "I'll tell you something," she said. "I corrected you in that interview because I'd made a decision before I walked into the room. I had been in too many positions where I did not say the thing that needed saying, and each time I didn't, there was a student not well served, a family that didn't know what their child actually needed, and a version of me that had made itself smaller to fit a space it wouldn't admit was too small. I decided I would not do that again, whatever the cost." She held his gaze. "The same principle applies now. I am not going to manage this into silence because the silence is convenient." "What are you not managing into silence?" The fact, she said, level and direct, the same quality that had stopped him mid-sentence in the first week, that the interest is not entirely one-directional. The garden was very quiet. Beyond the wall, George measured something with increasing enthusiasm. Dear friends, there is a particular quality to the moment when two people who have been carefully not saying a true thing finally say it. It does not arrive with drama. It arrives the way October does, quietly, with good light, and the sense that something has changed and the change is right. She went back to her notes. He went back to the house. That evening, when George came in red-cheeked and full of measurements and a theory about soil drainage that required immediate investigation, Lord Wyndham sat at the table with his son, listened to the theory, and offered a thought about where the underground spring might run. They argued about it for 20 minutes. The pleasant argument of two people who have both become interested in the same question. He found he was enjoying dinner. The Thursday dinners, as they came to be called, were never announced or arranged with ceremony. They simply became the shape of a particular week, the way true arrangements do, not through declaration, but through repetition. The first came 3 weeks after the garden conversation. Miss Price had stayed late to discuss a question George had raised about tidal patterns, one with no simple answer. Lord Wyndham, passing the schoolroom at 5:30, was drawn in. The discussion migrated to the dining room. Dinner was served. No one remarked on it. The following Thursday she was there again, and the one after that. She talked about George in a way the reports never quite captured. The shape of how his mind moved, the connections that surprised her, the morning he'd asked whether clouds had weight. She talked about the estate records she'd found in the study, which turned out to be illuminating, about the 1820s drainage dispute he'd always assumed was a legal matter, and was, in fact, a feud about a fence. He talked about the estate the way he never talked to his steward. The real version. The trouble with the northern lots. The tenant family struggling and too proud to say so. The decisions with no correct answer that had to be made anyway, and the unmistakable air of a woman. Connecting attention from the interview. And asked questions that went to the root of the matter. Her thoughts on the northern lots were better than his steward's. On the Thursday of the 8th week, he told her so. I know, she said. You could, on occasion, affect some modesty. I save my modesty for situations where I'm uncertain. I prefer not to waste it. Are you ever uncertain? She considered the question rather than rushing an answer. He had come to appreciate that about her. About facts, rarely. I verify before I conclude. About people, more often. People are harder. What are you uncertain about with people? At present, she said nothing. Good, he said and meant it. She smiled. Not often, but real when it came, and it changed her face entirely, he thought. I am going to spend a considerable time working for that smile, and I do not find that a difficult prospect. On the Thursday of the 12th week, 3 months since that first Monday, 12 dinners, 12 reports, 1 garden conversation, 1 sparrow notebook, 1 resolved question about drainage, and 1 still open question about tides. He said, at the end of the evening, I want to discuss the position. She went very still. Not to change its terms, he said quickly. George is doing well. You're excellent at the work. I have no wish to alter that. He looked at the good china, the 2 places, the room that had been set for 1 person for 3 years. I want to discuss whether the terms describe what is actually happening. The position is working. George is progressing better than you'd hoped. What's wrong with the terms? Nothing. I want to add to them. He looked at the November dark beyond the window. The Thursday dinners are not professional. They are not the dinners of an earl and his son's tutor. He paused, hunting. He was not often without the right word, and he was without it now. I do not have a word for what they are. I know that whatever it is, employer and employee does not cover it. She looked at the table for a long moment. The real quiet of someone thinking, not the managed quiet of someone deciding what to say. I told you in the interview I'd decided to stop making myself smaller to fit spaces too small for me. I came to dinner that first Thursday for the same reason, and 12 Thursdays later, I've found I have not been in a room where I could simply be what I am, without management, without calculating what's convenient to say, in a very long time. I would like to keep being in this room. Stay, he said. I am staying, I told you that on Monday. Not as the tutor. He stopped and started again, because the right words for a right thing deserve the effort. As the person who tells me what my son is good at, who writes notes about damp library books and knows the true cause of the fence dispute and argues about tides at 5:30 on a Thursday, as that person in this house, with me, you're asking me to marry you. Eventually, first I'm asking you to stay, the rest comes after. The staying and the marrying seem connected. They are. I want to be honest about what I'm asking. She looked at the two places, the good china, the room. You hired me because I corrected you, she said. Yes. In the first 4 minutes. I hired you because it was the most useful thing anyone had said to me in 7 weeks. I want you to keep saying useful things in this house for a very long time. Yes, she said. He breathed out. The position description will require some revision, she said. Fen can handle it. Fen has been listening from the next room since the garden conversation. He'll be unmanageable. He's already unmanageable. This won't materially change it. She smiled and he thought, there it is. I am going to spend the rest of my life in pursuit of that smile, and it is a very good prospect. He was right. The position description was indeed revised. Mr. Fen produced it the following Tuesday, set it on Lord Wyndham's desk with the composed expression of a man who has been entirely correct about something, and is gracious enough not to say so, and withdrew to the doorway. It read, in Fen's precise hand, position of Countess of Bellwood. Responsibilities to include oversight of the young master's education, library maintenance, estate consultation as appropriate, Thursday dinners, and the correction of the Earl of Bellwood at such times as correction is warranted. Not a word, Lord Wyndham said. Of course, my lord. A pause. Shall I file it? File it. He filed it. Miss Price, who remained Miss Price for a shorter time after that than the county had quite prepared itself for, though the county recovered, as counties do, and some of them came around entirely once they saw what George was like by spring, was in the schoolroom when Lord Wyndham came to find her. George was at the window with a notebook, recording the angle of morning light on snow. She looked up from her reading. He showed her the position description. She read it, and something quiet and private crossed her face. Fen, she said. Fen. As warranted, she read again. His word. It's the right word. The correction should be applied as needed, not as a standing practice. As warranted, he agreed, and sat in the chair beside the window near George, who went on measuring light angles with the absorbed seriousness of a boy who has learned that looking at a thing carefully is worthwhile work. Lord Wyndham looked at the November light on the snow and thought about the Tuesday in October when he'd interviewed 21 people and found the one who corrected him in 4 minutes. He thought about what she'd said in the garden, that she had decided, whatever the cost, never again to leave the true thing unsaid. The cost had been the position. She'd gotten the position anyway, and the Earl besides, which was either a further benefit or a further complication, depending, as she'd say, on the day. You're thinking about the interview again, she said, without looking up. Yes. You think about it often. It was 4 minutes that explained everything after. She turned a page. George, not looking up from his notebook, said, "Which interview?" "The one that mattered." George considered this with the focused seriousness of a boy learning to think before he concludes. "Was it the one where she told you something was wrong?" "Yes." He nodded once, satisfied, and went back to his light angles. I would have hired her too. Lord Wyndham looked at Cecilia. Cecilia looked up. They held it a moment, the two of them, in the quiet room, with the November light coming through the window and George measuring angles and the whole of Bellwood Manor running around them as it had been running since a Monday in October. Running well, running truly, because he had finally stopped, looking for someone who would agree with him, and hired instead the person who would not. And that, dear friends, is the story of the 21st interview. A man who has rejected 20 candidates is not a difficult man. He is a man who has not yet understood what he's asking for, and the moment he meets the person who understands it before he does, and is not afraid to say so, the difficulty resolves. Not because he has changed, but because he has been given at last something true to hold on to. If you've found something true to hold on to, you know exactly what I mean. If you haven't yet, stay close. The right interview is coming, in 4 minutes, or on a Tuesday, in October, or in a garden with a notebook full of sparrows, and when it arrives, you'll know it the way Lord Wyndham knew it. You'll think, 20 times before this, you'll think, and then, you'll think, there it is. If this story warmed something in you the way it warms me each time I tell it, come sit with us again by the fire at Bellwood. There are other stories where this one came from, good ones, true ones, the kind that explain, 4 minutes in, everything that follows. The position description is filed as warranted. Everything else was simply the rest of their lives, which was, by any accounting, the most interesting arrangement either of them ever held.